All right, guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Jacksonian democracy. And we're going to get into in just a little bit what we mean by that. And we are going to be talking about another pretty important election in American history. But before we get into it, I thought it'd be kind of fun to kind of look at an imaginary election. So in this imaginary election, if we have these four presidential candidates, A through D, you can see here President A, he used to be a vice president. President B, C, and D were all secretaries of state. So if you were wanting to become president in our kind of imaginary election that we're talking about right now, based on what you see here, Secretary of State is probably the job historically that you would want to have. And in this election, if we have seen the last four presidents, the job that you want to have as Secretary of State, I want you to kind of like pick out who on this list you feel like would be the most qualified to become president and who you feel like would be least qualified. A lot of times when I ask my students this, a lot of them will put treasurer down at the very bottom as like the least qualified. Treasurer are the people who are in charge of the money and the budget and things like that. A lot of people choose military hero as the most qualified, or they'll choose Secretary of State. And then Speaker of the House usually falls somewhere in the middle. And so if we took our hypothetical election and we looked at the results here, would you be able to tell me who won? If you said that candidate D, which would have been our military hero, won, you actually aren't necessarily correct. According to the 12th Amendment, you have to have what's known as a majority of the electoral votes in order to be considered the winner. And if there is no majority winner, then the House of Representatives is the one who gets to choose who the next president is going to be. And so if you take a look at this, candidate D didn't have the majority. Majority means you would have to have over half of the total number of votes. Meaning if we took all the people in the Electoral College, if you were able to get more than half, then yes, you would be the winner. But since he didn't outright get that, he is not technically the actual winner. This kind of made-up election is very similar to a real election that we're going to learn about today. You had George Washington, who just kind of came into president because he was just very, very popular, but he was also a military hero. John Adams was Washington's vice president. Thomas Jefferson served as the Secretary of State for Washington and then as the Vice President for Adams. James Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Monroe was also Madison's Secretary of State. So you can see on here that it tends to be Secretary of State was just like a really good job to have if you wanted to go on to become a president. And so in this election of 1824, we had those four candidates. John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State, so it seemed like he was pretty high up there if we're going based off of history to become our next president. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. William Crawford was the Secretary of Treasury. Andrew Jackson was then the military hero. He is best known for being the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And that's how we get to this concept of Jacksonian democracy. Because in 1824, four people ran for president. Those four that we just talked about: Crawford, Adams, Jackson, and Clay. We are going to see some new political parties here. The Democratic Republican Party is the only major political party here. Four candidates all run against each other from that same political party. Andrew Jackson is what's known as a favorite son when we talk about politics. This means that he mostly is getting support from his home state and not necessarily from the party that he's saying he's running with. The Democratic Republican Party isn't really putting a lot of backing behind Andrew Jackson. He just was not the kind of person that they wanted to be president. But he's from Tennessee. He was raised in poverty. He was a war hero in the War of 1812. He tended to have a very short fuse temper. And he often claimed to speak for Americans who felt like they had been left out of politics. He and a lot of people who supported him felt like government was working for big business and they didn't really care about the little guy. And so he got a lot of people, especially from his home state, on his side. Now, these were the the results of the election of 1824. As you can see, Jackson technically had what's known as a plurality. He didn't have the majority, which means he would need to have more than 50% of the vote. So the House is going to be the one who chooses the president. Okay. So although Jackson had the plurality, which is the most votes total, he didn't have a majority, but neither did anybody else, which means they would need to have greater than half of the total. And here's where we get to this concept of a corrupt bargain. John Quincy Adams went to dinner with Henry Clay. Henry Clay came over to his house and they had dinner. At that dinner, they kind of talked because Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House, and he knows, like, based on the votes, like, he's not going to win. Like, he's not in the top running. It's just not going to happen. But he does hold a lot of power in the House of Representatives. If he endorsed one candidate over the other, then a lot of people would probably follow his lead and vote the same way as him. And so that's why John Quincy Adams wants to meet and talk with him. And at this dinner, they kind of agree, hey, if you vote for me for president, then I will make you my Secretary of State. And this was kind of a way to kind of set up Henry Clay to possibly be a future president. And so Clay promised to support him if Adams made him Secretary of State when he got elected. When the election finally rolls around, the House chose Adams, and Adams appointed Clay as the Secretary of State. Jackson was a very sore loser, and he accused Jackson and Clay of working together in a corrupt bargain. He accused John Quincy Adams of cheating in this election. And I kind of want to know what you guys think. Do you feel like John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had a corrupt bargain, something that possibly cost Jackson the election in the presidency in 1824? Do you feel like that this was like, because they definitely like made a deal, they met together, but whether or not you feel like this was something that John Quincy Adams shouldn't have done, do you feel like it was wrong? Do you feel like Andrew Jackson had the election stolen from him? Because he was like kind of in the lead whenever it was the first time around, the popular vote, before it moved on to the House. So you can kind of see why Jackson might feel like he's been robbed here, but I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. John Quincy Adams, regardless, in the election of 1824, becomes the 6th president of the United States. John Quincy Adams, in case you haven't caught on, is the son of John Adams, our 2nd president, and Abigail Adams. He does a few things while he's president. A big thing that he tends to be known for is founding the Smithsonian Institution. I'll post a link to this video in the description, so make sure you open this up in YouTube and then you can see the link down below. It's going to go into a little bit more detail about John Quincy Adams and what he did while he was president, or what he was even able to attempt to get done, because Andrew Jackson and his supporters are not going to make his life very good or very easy. While he was president, he told Congress that he wanted to like build more roads, he wanted to build more canals, he wanted to like work on like infrastructure, he wanted to build a university, and he wanted to support scientific research. But his opponents believed that like anything that he tried to do, people didn't really trust him, and so they felt like anything he tried to do, they were like, okay, but who would you make a deal with to get this done? Like, who are you benefiting here? Like, who's like holding something over you? We feel like you're like being blackmailed to do stuff. We can't trust that anything you're doing is like for the greater good, that you're just trying to like fulfill a promise that you made to somebody to give them power. And so people like didn't really trust him for that. And then Jackson and his supporters argued that like the government shouldn't be involved so much, like it's not their job, they need to mind their own business. Fast forward 4 more years to 1828. The Democratic Republican Party has split into 2 separate parties. We're still not to like Democrats and Republicans, but the Democratic Party is going to pop up here. The Democrats are going to support Jackson, who's a big fan of states' rights and does not trust the central government. And the other political party are going to be the National Republicans. These guys support Adams, and they're also big fans of building roads and the national bank. So they're a fan of like big government projects. During the 1828 election, both sides resorted to something that you see in politics all the time now called mudslinging, which is where you try to ruin the other person's reputation with insults. This is also going to be the first election where we see people using slogans and buttons and going to rallies, things that are very commonplace nowadays in today's election. Jackson got the most votes from the frontier states and many of the southern states that tended to be the type of people who supported him. People who were like kind of like what you would call quote unquote like normal, ordinary American citizens. John C. Calhoun, in the middle of the election, and this is kind of something that kind of clinched it for people, he was John Quincy Adams' vice president. In the middle of the election, he switched parties to run with Jackson as his vice president instead. And because of that, well, people were like, well, if his own vice president doesn't even want to be with him, then how can we trust him? And so Jackson won very easily. His supporters officially formed the Democratic Party, and Andrew Jackson is now the 7th president of the United States. His nickname was Old Hickory because he was as tough as a hickory stick. Andrew Jackson had a lot of supporters for a few different reasons. And to go back before we talk about that, the reason why he's called Old Hickory is because he's very tough. Hickory trees are just historically very difficult to remove. And he actually walked around with an old hickory cane that he often used to attack people with whenever he lost his temper with them. Andrew Jackson had a lot of different supporters for many reasons. He was a patriot. He fought in the American Revolution. He was self-made. He was a war hero. He expanded voting rights to all white American men. So you just had to like be white and American citizen and you could be able to vote now. So he made it easier for people to vote. That still excludes women and people of color. And he favored what he called the common man. And he also favored states' rights. He also started something that people called the spoils system, where as soon as he came in power, he pretty much fired everybody who had a job in the federal government and replaced them all with people who supported him. It was almost like he was handing out government jobs to people who had supported him and helped him win, which is almost exactly what he accused John Quincy Adams of doing. But he is doing it to like everybody who ever supported him. So because of that, people kind of clamored around him because they wanted to like get the power that he had. A lot of people who were Democrats didn't like that the government all of a sudden had become a bureaucracy and that it was filled with all these people who they hadn't elected, and these were the people who were carrying out laws. They were not huge fans of that. Political parties after this started using something called nominating conventions. Delegates from the state would come in and choose the party's presidential candidate. It gets more people the ability to participate in government. So here's what a nominating convention would have looked like back in the day. It's kind of where they announced like, here are the people that we're going to be using as our candidates, and it kind of introduces them to everybody so people feel like, oh yeah, I know who's running. And we still do stuff very similar today. Remember, we talked about last time tariffs were a huge issue for people. A lot of Americans felt like the state should be able to kind of nullify or refuse to accept a federal law if it wasn't in the state's best interest, which means they would be able to do kind of what they'd been doing in the Articles of Confederation and just ignore a law if they didn't like it. Jackson, hearing about that, passed what's called the Force Bill, which allowed the president to use force in the military to enforce federal law. He put this into power after his own vice president, Henry Clay, was the one who was really pushing for this nullification, and that the state should have this ability. And so Jackson actually threatened to hang his vice president, and then went on to kick him out of office. Like, he got rid of Henry Clay and replaced him with a new vice president. Andrew Jackson fired almost everybody who worked in his cabinet and replaced them with new people. There's only one person in his cabinet who stuck with him the whole way, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. He'll actually be our 8th president. Something else that Jackson did while he was president is pass the Maysview Road Bill. This asked the government, Kentucky, asked the government to pay to build a road that would go through Kentucky. And Jackson vetoed this law and passed the Maysville Road Bill, which said federal government should only have to pay for projects that benefit the entire nation. Building this one road that only goes through Kentucky did not benefit the entire country. It only benefited Kentucky. But since he was originally from Kentucky, they thought he would just automatically approve of it. But he wasn't just going to be a pushover. There were a lot of different political cartoons during this time period about Andrew Jackson, and most of them were not very nice. You saw, like, here, like, there's a staircase leading up to despotism, which is another word for, like, having a king. And it was all these different people who felt like they were being stepped on by the people who were in power. Andrew Jackson, it seemed like, was trying to hold them back. But in this one, you see, like, Andrew Jackson's presidency was compared to, like, a sinking ship. And when a ship is about to sink, the rats that are on board will actually be the ones to notice the water coming into the ship first, and they'll be the first ones to leave. So it was a common saying among sailors that if a ship is sinking, like, you'll see the rats running off, and that's your clue to get off the ship because something is wrong. And you'll notice that each of these little rats have a different human head on them. These were all different members of his cabinet who all left or were fired. The only one who's not going to be able to get away is the one that he has his foot on its tail, and that is Martin Van Buren. He's going to be president number 8, and he's going to, however reluctantly, stick it out with Andrew Jackson in his very kind of rough and tumble presidency. This is another one. Remember, his nickname was Old Hickory. Martin Van Buren is the bird falling out of the tree. Andrew Jackson is the one that's still sitting in the nest. And Democrats created this one as a way of trying to say, like, they're trying to get rid of Andrew Jackson, but like a hickory tree, like, it's really hard to get rid of him. This is a really good political cartoon by Andrew Jackson talking about the spoil system. You can see that there are skulls all over here. There are dollar signs. It says spoils on the side. The inscription reads, "To the victor belong the spoils." It shows him riding a pig that has dollar signs all over it. You can see the White House off in the background, and it's running through, the pig is running through a bunch of different things that say things like fraud and bribery, plunder, all referencing the spoil system. This is just the beginning of Andrew Jackson's presidency. He is going to do a lot while he's president, and not all of it's very good. But we will talk about that next time.